you're a mom, you're all these other things, but you're also a candidate for presidency, for the vice presidency of the United States.
Isn't that the weirdest thing you've ever said? Right. Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. It's the weirdest thing. I always was very adamant that I would never run for office. I'm holding myself together right now because I like to cuss a lot, right? So, I like to cuss a lot and I like to laugh a lot. And neither of those tend to be the traits of a vice presidential candidate. But
why are you doing it?
So I was comfortable to be a very inspired supporter of Dr. Cornel West. He's been somebody who's been influential in my life since I was an undergrad. When I was an undergrad at Howard University, that was my first time meeting him. Race Matters had recently come out, and it was really, really influential for me as an African American studies major. And so I became deeply inspired by his intellectual work. And then over this last, few decades, he's really been someone who's modeled for many of us what it means to be a public intellectual in the truest sense. Make his intellectual work accessible to everybody. And also, if you believe these things, what are you doing about these things? So I remember him marching in 2014 alongside us in Ferguson, right? I remember my oldest child's first meeting of him was in Ferguson as well, when the young people stormed the stage and actually took the mic from Dr. Cornel West and said, it's the young people's turn to speak. And I just was really deeply inspired by not only his campaign platform of truth, justice, and love, but the depth of the policy pillars that talk about economic justice in real terms, not just a slogan, economic justice, but economic justice means a $27 an hour federal minimum wage, right? We want not just health care for all, we want health care justice, which means we have to address medical apartheid, right? And so I was deeply inspired. And so I used to host a radio program. Apparently you can't do that if you're a vice presidential candidate, so I'm not the host right now, but I had interviewed him as a presidential candidate on my show, and a couple days later, he and his wife, Annahita, called me, and I thought they were calling to follow up on the interview. And then they paused, and he's never at a loss for words. He wasn't at a loss for words, but there were more pauses in there than usual. And he said, or she said, well, let's just say it. Let's just ask. And they said, would you consider being his vice presidential running mate, being my vice presidential running mate? And my heart soared and my spirit wanted to say yes immediately because I believe in this, right? But then I had to ask my kids and my mama and my organizing family, and came back a few days later and said yes. And I believe that what this campaign will do is disrupt the corporate-controlled, the corporate-owned duopoly.
You're going to get this question from everybody. I'll ask it as well. What do you say to people who say, well, this is no year for this kind of third-party contest when it's so important not to let Donald Trump have a second term with his authoritarian tendencies and his admission that he would only be a dictator to begin?
Right. So I want to be very clear. I see Donald Trump as the embodiment of evil, right? And I also know that Joe Biden is funding and fueling a genocide. I also know that Joe Biden has called for the criminalization of young protesters, especially who dare to speak up. That said, as a scholar, as a political scientist, I've been scouring research for data that supports the rhetoric that it's coming from the liberal establishment, that, what do they say, that a vote for a third party is a vote for Trump. In fact, the data on non-voting is actually much more compelling. It sounds to me, reading the data on non-voting, that what we'll be doing, what we are doing, is mobilizing voters who would not have otherwise voted. And especially when we talk about these young people who are rising up. You know, my oldest child is now 20 years old, and she and all of their peers call him Genocide Joe. they would never, ever, ever cast a ballot for him. What Dr. West and I do is offer an opportunity for them to vote for something, for someone. And so my hope and our intention is to inspire voters to vote for what they believe in. Vote their vision, not their fear, is what we say.